It was April 3rd, 1985, Trempealeau County, Wisconsin, 6:15 in the morning. Marvin Kesler was standing in a stranger's machine yard 12 miles from his own farm in 23 degrees of cold that hadn't decided yet whether it was still winter or had given up trying. He had a flashlight in one hand and a notepad in the other. In front of him was a Copeland two-stage compressor mounted on a steel skid, big, dirty, a slow oil weep from the shaft seal, that had been sitting untouched since the previous October, when the bank had called the note on the Halverson dairy and the family had 30 days to get out. The auction was scheduled to start at 9. Marv had been here since before sunrise. He went through his checklist. 30 points, written in his careful handwriting on a single sheet of notebook paper he'd folded and unfolded so many times the creases were starting to tear. Compressor housing, solid. Refrigerant lines, intact, no visible damage. Condenser fan, seized, but the bearing looked replaceable. Electrical cabinet, dry inside, no corrosion on the terminals. He put his hand on the compressor body the way a mechanic puts his hand on an engine block, feeling for something that doesn't have a name, but that you recognize when it's there. Or when it isn't. It was there. He wrote a number at the bottom of his checklist, his maximum bid. He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded the paper back up and put it in his shirt pocket and waited for 9 o'clock. That compressor sold for $60. Marv was the only bidder. When his neighbor, Gene Hafner, saw it on the back of Marv's flatbed that afternoon, he said, "Marv, that's junk. You hauled home $60 worth of junk." Marv lifted the tailgate, dropped the hitch pin, said, "Maybe," and then he drove it home. That $60 compressor, and the dozen like it that followed over the next 18 months, would become the foundation of one of the most quietly remarkable storage systems in Trempealeau County. Not because Marv had more money than his neighbors, not because he had access to anything they didn't, but because in the middle of the worst farm crisis in 50 years, when everyone around him was watching the dairy operations close and seeing only loss, Marvin Kesler looked at the exact same equipment going to scrap and saw something entirely different. This is his story. Marv Kesler was 57 years old in 1987. He'd farmed the same ground his whole life, 140 acres in the ridge and coulee country of western Wisconsin, the kind of landscape that looks like God pressed his thumb into the earth and left a wrinkle. Deep valleys, wooded hillsides, small fields carved out of terrain that never made it easy. The Kesler place sat along the Black River bottomland, with a creek that ran copper-colored in the fall and froze solid by December. Marv grew row crops mostly, corn, soybeans, some small grains. He kept a small potato patch that he'd been tending for 30 years. He was not a dairy farmer and never had been, which in that part of Wisconsin put him in a distinct minority. Trempealeau County was dairy country, always had been. The rolling hills, the grass, the cool summers. It was country built for Holstein cows and stainless steel milk tanks and the low hum of refrigeration equipment running 24 hours a day. But Marv had grown up watching his father fight with livestock, and he decided early on that he wanted nothing to do with animals that needed milking twice a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, no exceptions, no holidays, no rest. His father had milked 40 cows, and it had aged him a decade for every year he did it. Marv looked at that and said, "No thank you." So he farmed the row crops, kept the potato ground, and built a reputation as the man you called when something mechanical needed sorting out. That was Marv's real gift, not the farming, though he was a decent farmer. The gift was mechanical. The man could look at a piece of equipment the way a doctor looks at a patient, quietly, carefully, turning things over in his mind, and then go to work with a wrench and a welder and a box of parts he'd been saving for 20 years, and he would fix it, whatever it was. He'd rebuilt tractor engines in his shed. He'd rewired combines. He'd fabricated replacement parts for equipment the manufacturer hadn't made parts for since 1962. His shop was something to see. Every wall was pegboard, and every peg had something hanging on it, a tool, a fitting, a hose clamp, a coil of copper tubing. Drawers along the back wall, each one labeled in Marv's careful handwriting, Not neat handwriting, careful handwriting. There's a difference. Neat means pretty. Careful means every letter is exactly where it's supposed to be, so there's no confusion later. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, just economical with words the way he was economical with everything else. He'd answer a question with exactly as many words as the question required, and then he'd stop talking and go back to what he was doing. His wife Ruth said he'd talked more in the first 2 years of their marriage than in the 30 years that followed, and she said it with a smile that made clear she didn't consider this a problem. They had 2 sons, both gone by the mid-80s, one to Milwaukee, one to the Army, and then to Oregon. The farm was Marv and Ruth, and the land and the machines. And in 1985, when the whole agricultural world started coming apart at the seams, what Marv had to work with was what was already there. To understand what Marv saw, you have to understand what was happening in Wisconsin in those years. The 1982 farm crisis did not arrive all at once. It came the way a flood comes. First, a little water in the low spots, then more. Then suddenly you're standing on your porch watching the whole field go under, and you can't quite believe it happened this fast, even though the rain has been falling for weeks. The crisis had roots that stretched back into the 1970s, when land values went vertical and banks were practically pushing loans on farmers who wanted to expand. Grow or die, the saying went. Get big or get out. And so farmers borrowed. They bought more ground. They built new facilities. They put in better milking parlors, larger freestall barns, modern bulk tanks with refrigeration systems built to handle 100, 200, 300 cows. And then, in the early 80s, interest rates went through the ceiling, land values collapsed, and commodity prices fell through the floor. In Wisconsin, in Trempealeau County in particular, the dairy operations were the hardest hit. A small dairy farmer milking 60, 70, 80 cows was already operating on margins thin enough to read a newspaper through. When milk prices dropped and the loan payments stayed exactly the same and the feed costs didn't fall nearly as fast as the milk price did, those margins didn't just get thin, they disappeared. Between 1980 and 1990, Wisconsin lost more than 15,000 dairy farms. 15,000. Some of those were consolidations, small operations absorbed into bigger ones, but a great many of them were simply closures. Farms that had been in families for 3 generations, 4 generations, going quiet. The cows sold, the equipment auctioned, the buildings left to whatever Wisconsin winters decided to do to them. In Trempealeau County, you could drive the back roads in 1985 and 1986 and see it happening in real time. The auction signs, the emptied lots, the milk houses with their doors hanging open, the bulk tanks sitting in yards because nobody had come to haul them away yet. And when a dairy operation shut down, it left behind more than just an empty barn. It left behind equipment, serious equipment, industrial refrigeration systems that had been built to keep hundreds of gallons of fresh milk at 35 degrees regardless of what the temperature was outside. Bulk tank cooling units, compressors, condensing units, evaporator coils, copper refrigerant lines, all of it engineered to a standard that most agricultural cold storage equipment never approached. For the people shutting down those farms, that equipment was a problem to be solved. It was heavy, it was specialized, and the market for used dairy refrigeration in 1985 was not exactly thriving, because the farms that might have bought it were closing too. So it went for whatever it would bring. Scrap prices, liquidation prices, prices that made serious equipment feel worthless because the context that gave it value had been torn away. Marv Kesler noticed. It started the way a lot of things started for Marv, not with a plan exactly, but with a noticing. He was at an auction in the spring of 1984. A dairy operation over near Independence, maybe 12 miles from his place, was liquidating. The Halverson farm, been in that family since the 1920s. Marv wasn't there for the dairy equipment. He was there looking at a grain auger and a set of field cultivator shovels. But while he was walking the yard, he stopped in front of the milk house. Inside was a condensing unit, a big Copeland 2-stage compressor with a York condenser bolted to a steel skid. The whole assembly was maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. It was dirty. The belt on the condenser fan was cracked and glazed. There was a slow oil weep from one of the compressor shaft seals. But the housing was solid, the copper tubing was intact, And when Marv leaned in and looked at the service data plate, he could see this unit had been professionally maintained and was less than 12 years old. It sold for $45 to a scrap dealer from La Crosse. Marv stood there and watched it go on to the scrap truck and felt something turn over in his mind. Not quite an idea yet, more like the feeling you get when you've misread a map and suddenly the landscape starts making sense in a different way. He went home and spent 3 evenings in his shop going through a refrigeration manual he'd picked up at a farm sale 5 years earlier and never opened. He wasn't a refrigeration man. He knew the basics, had worked on his own milk cooler years back, knew the refrigerant circuit, understood pressure and temperature relationships in a general way, but he'd never thought seriously about what it would take to adapt a dairy refrigeration system for grain or vegetable storage. He started thinking about it. By 1985, when the farm closures were accelerating and auction ads were running in the Trempealeau County Tribune every other week, Marv had done enough reading to know what he was looking at. He'd talked to a refrigeration technician over in Whitehall, a man named Stu Brandt, who serviced dairy equipment and was watching his customer base evaporate. And Stu had walked him through the engineering in enough detail that Marv understood the gaps between what dairy refrigeration was designed to do and what he needed it to do. Dairy refrigeration is designed for precision. You need milk held in a very specific temperature range, 34 to 38 degrees, and you need it held there consistently because milk is unforgiving. The equipment is built to that standard: oversized refrigerant circuits, robust compressors, reliable controls. Grain storage operates on different principles. Corn going into a bin for winter storage in Wisconsin needs to be cooled, yes, but the target temperature is more forgiving. You're aiming for somewhere between 28 and 40 degrees, depending on the crop and the moisture content. Potatoes want 40 to 45 degrees and some humidity control. Root vegetables are similar. The precision requirements are lower than dairy milk, but the volume of air you need to condition is potentially much larger. What Marv saw, and what nobody else seemed to be looking at, was that a slightly oversized dairy refrigeration unit, adapted for air cooling rather than direct contact chilling, could handle the climate control needs of a good-sized storage structure at a fraction of the cost of purpose-built agricultural cold storage equipment. The math was not complicated. A new refrigeration system for a serious grain and vegetable storage facility in 1985 would cost $8,000, $10,000, $12,000 installed, depending on the size. A dairy condensing unit pulled from a closing farm, with some fabrication work and adaptation, might cost him $300 in parts and a week of his own labor. Marv started buying. He bought carefully. He wasn't interested in junk, in units that had been run to death or that needed compressor rebuilds beyond his capability. He was looking for equipment that had suffered from the farm crisis rather than from hard use or neglect. A unit from a farm that had closed suddenly because the bank called the note. That unit might be perfectly sound mechanically. It had just lost its context. He would show up at auctions, or he would call ahead when he heard a farm was liquidating, and he would walk through the milk house with a flashlight and a notepad, and he would look at compressor hours and maintenance records and refrigerant pressures and belt condition and the state of the electrical connections. He'd developed a checklist, written in that careful handwriting of his, that covered about 30 points of inspection. If it passed, he'd make an offer. Usually somewhere between $40 and $100, depending on the size and condition. By the end of 1985, he had 3 condensing units in his machine shed, 2 bulk tank evaporator coils, about 200 feet of recovered refrigerant copper tubing, 4 compressors in various states of completeness, and a collection of electrical controls panels that Stu Brandt had helped him sort into useful and scrap piles. Ruth Kesler, who had watched her husband's enthusiasms for 40 years without once telling him he couldn't do something, did ask one question. She stood in the machine shed doorway one evening in November 1985, looked at the organized accumulation of industrial refrigeration equipment filling half the available floor space, and said, "Marv, what exactly is the plan here?" Marv was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Storage. For the potatoes. And the grain. Maybe more than that eventually. Ruth nodded, went back inside. That was enough. The first winter was spent in planning and fabrication. Marv had identified an old pole barn on the west side of his property, a structure that had been used for equipment storage, maybe 40 feet wide and 60 feet long, with a dirt floor that he'd put a concrete slab on 15 years earlier. The walls were board and batten over rough-sawn lumber framing. The roof was steel. It was cold in winter and warm in summer, and it was not, by any reasonable measure, a climate-controlled space. But it had the bones. He started with insulation. This was the part that consumed most of that first winter. Cutting and fitting rigid foam board between the wall studs, framing an insulated ceiling below the roof structure, building an insulated partition that would divide the building into a larger storage bay and a smaller mechanical room on the north end. He sourced materials carefully, looking for salvage where he could find it. Foam board from a building supply place in La Crosse that was clearing discontinued inventory. Used framing lumber from a barn that had come down in a windstorm the previous fall. The vapor barrier went up in February. Marv worked in his coat and his Sorel boots and his canvas shop gloves, and the temperature in the building was not much above zero on the cold days, and he worked steadily and without complaint because that was his nature, and because he had a picture in his mind of what this space was going to be, and he trusted the picture. The refrigeration work began in earnest in March, when Stu Brandt could come out for 2 consecutive weekends. The system Marv had decided on was a 2-stage approach. The primary cooling would come from a York condensing unit he'd bought from the Halverson estate auction. This was not the same unit he'd watched go for scrap in 1984, but a nearly identical model he'd found at another sale. This unit, after a new shaft seal on the compressor and fresh refrigerant and a set of new belts on the condenser fan, ran cleanly and held pressure exactly as it should. The evaporator coils, the components that actually absorbed heat from the storage space, came from 2 different farms. Marv and Stu had to adapt them from their original milk cooling configurations to air cooling duty. This required fabricating new coil mounts, adapting the refrigerant connections, and building simple sheet metal shrouds to direct air across the coil surfaces. Stu handled the refrigerant work, the recovery, the leak testing, the charging. Marv handled the fabrication, the electrical, the structural mounting. The control system was Marv's particular pride. Rather than the simple thermostat that most small cold storage operations used, he built a staging system using controls salvaged from the dairy equipment. Controls designed for precise temperature management in a commercial dairy context that would cycle the refrigeration load across 2 compressors rather than running 1 unit constantly. This extended compressor life, reduced electrical demand spikes, and gave him redundancy. If one compressor had a problem, the other kept running. He wired this himself, spent about 2 weeks on it, testing and tracing and checking his work against the electrical diagrams he'd drawn in a composition notebook. He'd never taken a formal course in refrigeration controls. He'd learned by reading, by asking Stu pointed questions, and by that process of careful mechanical reasoning that had been working for him his whole life. By mid-April of 1986, the first system was operational. He put 60 degrees on the space, walked away, came back 2 hours later, 61 degrees. He adjusted, came back the next morning, 59.5. He ran it for a week before he would commit to using it for anything he cared about. It held temperature. It cycled cleanly. The condensers ran quiet and the compressors sounded healthy. That particular low, steady sound of a refrigeration compressor that's properly loaded, which is different from the strained, uneven note of a unit that's fighting itself. He brought Ruth out to see it. She stood in the storage bay in her coat, her breath making small clouds, and she felt the cool air coming off the evaporator coils, and she looked at Marv. He said, "Should hold 40 degrees right through August." She said, "Well, I'll be." That fall, he stored 4,000 bushels of corn in the large bay and 800 hundredweight of potatoes in the smaller section he'd partitioned off with a removable wall. He kept the corn at 34 degrees and controlled the humidity with a small supplemental system, a dairy evaporator coil from yet another closed farm, this one repurposed to run in dehumidification mode. The potatoes he held at 41 degrees with slightly higher humidity, which was exactly what potatoes wanted. He lost almost nothing that winter. His corn came out of storage in April with moisture content within 0.5% of where it had gone in. His potatoes, all 800 weight of them, graded out nearly clean when he marketed them in March. He compared these results to what he'd been getting with his old uncontrolled storage, and the difference was not subtle. It was the difference between farming and guessing. Word got around. It always does. Let's be honest about something. In 1985, when Marv Kesler started loading salvaged dairy refrigeration equipment onto his flatbed truck and hauling it home, the general opinion in Trempealeau County was not favorable. Gene Hafner, as we've already noted, called it hauling scrap. Gene was not alone. At the elevator in Blair, at the coffee counter in the diner in Whitehall, at the implement dealer in Arcadia, where farmers tended to congregate on Tuesday mornings, the word that came up most often in connection with Marv Kesler's project was some variation of peculiar. Some of it was gentle ribbing. Some of it was genuine skepticism. There was a contingent that believed, firmly and vocally, that refrigeration equipment pulled from closed dairy farms was equipment that had been run too hard and maintained too poorly to be of any use to anybody. There was another contingent that thought the whole concept of refrigerated grain storage was unnecessary for a farmer of Marv's scale. And there was a smaller contingent, this is always the most stinging variety of opposition, that considered the project vaguely embarrassing, the kind of thing that made the neighborhood look like a salvage yard. None of this reached Marv directly, because nobody in Trempealeau County was going to say that kind of thing to Marv Kesler's face. He was too quiet, too steady, and too well known for the quality of his mechanical work to be dismissed openly. But it circulated. These things always circulate. The summer of 1987 changed the conversation. That summer, Wisconsin got hit with a stretch of hot, humid weather in July and August that put serious pressure on stored grain across the region. Temperatures in the 90s, humidity running high. The combination is grain's enemy. Moisture migration in stored corn, the beginnings of mold, the creep of mycotoxins in bins that weren't adequately conditioned. A lot of farmers in the county had corn in storage from the previous fall, waiting on a better price, and that corn was now at risk. The County Extension Office put out an advisory in late July, urging farmers to check their stored grain and consider aeration. Some did. Others couldn't afford the electricity bills for continuous aeration fans. A few found problems too advanced to fix. Corn that had to be marketed immediately at discounted prices because it was going downhill fast. Marv's corn was fine. His storage structure sat at 34 degrees, regardless of what the thermometer outside was doing. The humidity was controlled. The corn in his large bay was as sound in late August as it had been the previous November when it went in. He pulled samples at the beginning of August and ran moisture tests, and the numbers were exactly where he wanted them. He ended up marketing that corn in September, when prices had recovered slightly from the summer low, and the quality premium he got for his low-moisture, clean-conditioned corn added another 11 cents a bushel over what the distressed conditioned corn in the county was bringing. On 4,000 bushels, 11 cents a bushel is $440. That doesn't sound like much, but against the cost basis of his storage system, maybe $800 in parts and materials and his own labor, it was already more than halfway to payback in 2 marketing cycles. And the potatoes. In 1987, Marv had expanded his potato section to store 1,200 hundredweight. He held them at 41 degrees and sold them in late winter, as he'd done the previous year, to a processing operation that was paying a premium for consistent quality late-season stock. His neighbors with uncontrolled cellars and older conventional storage were dealing with the usual attrition, shrinkage, sprouting, some disease pressure, the inevitable quality degradation that comes from temperature cycling through a Wisconsin winter. Marv's potatoes came out looking like they'd just been harvested. By the fall of 1987, Gene Hafner was not calling it scrap anymore. Gene was, in fact, standing in Marv's storage barn on a September afternoon, looking at the system with the expression of a man who is doing fairly significant internal arithmetic. He walked around the condensing unit. He looked at the evaporator mounts. He looked at the control panel and the temperature gauges and the cycling indicators. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "How much you into this?" Marv told him. Parts and materials, right around $840, his own labor, not counted. Gene was quiet again for a moment. "A new system for my potato cellar," Gene said. "Deer Dealer priced it out last year. 11,000 installed." Marv nodded. "And yours works?" "Works fine," Marv said. Gene went home and thought about it for 2 weeks. Then he called Marv and asked if he'd help him build one. Gene was the first. He was not the last. Over the following 3 years, Marv helped 8 neighboring farmers build adapted refrigeration systems using salvaged dairy equipment. He didn't charge for his labor. That wasn't how things worked in that community. You helped your neighbors, and your neighbors helped you, and the accounting was kept in a ledger that nobody wrote down, but everybody understood. He did charge a finder's fee of sorts. He was still the primary source of salvaged equipment, and he continued to buy and refurbish units for the farmers who needed them. He got better at the adaptation work as he went. By 1988, he developed a standard approach, a documentation package almost, though he would have laughed at that description. He knew which control systems were most reliable. He knew the common failure points on the compressors he was working with. He knew, from experience now rather than theory, exactly what temperature and humidity profiles worked for which crops. He'd built a small data record, handwritten in composition notebooks, the same kind he'd always used, tracking temperatures and outcomes across multiple storage seasons. Stu Brandt, the refrigeration technician, started referring customers to Marv, not officially, just in conversation, the way things happened in that county. "You want to look at something that works and doesn't cost you an arm and a leg? Go talk to Marv Kesler over by the Black River." The county extension agent came out in the spring of 1989. Young man named Davis, newly posted to the area, trying to get a feel for what farmers in his territory were actually doing. He walked through Marv's storage building and looked at the system and asked very careful questions, writing things down in his own notebook. He was respectful and attentive, and at the end of the tour he said, "Mr. Kesler, would you be willing to do a brief presentation at the winter meeting? We've had a lot of interest in low-cost storage options." Marv thought about it. "I don't give presentations," he said. Davis waited. "But you can bring people out here," Marv said. "Show them the system." In February 1990, 22 farmers came to the Kesler farm on a Tuesday afternoon. Marv walked them through the storage building. He showed them the condensing units, the evaporator mounts, the control panel. He answered questions in his economical way, exactly as many words as the question required. He showed them his temperature logs. He showed them his outcome records. He talked about what equipment to look for and what to avoid. A few of those 22 farmers built systems within the following year. Others didn't, for various reasons: capital constraints, insufficient storage volume to justify the work, crops that didn't require controlled storage. But all of them went home with a piece of information they hadn't had before: that there was a way to do this that worked, and that a man in their county had proved it over 4 storage seasons with real crops and real numbers. Marv Kesler farmed until he was in his late 60s. He sold the operation in the mid-1990s, not under pressure, not because of the crisis, but because he and Ruth had decided the time was right and the terms were acceptable, and there was a younger family from the next county who wanted the ground and were willing to do right by it. He kept the machine shed. That was in the purchase agreement. Marv kept the machine shed and the 2 acres it sat on, and he kept on working in it for another decade. He did repair work for neighbors. He continued to be the man you called when something mechanical needed sorting out. He consulted, and that's too formal a word for what he actually did, which was mostly answering questions while looking at the thing that was broken, on a handful of adapted refrigeration systems that younger farmers in the county were building, some of them inspired by what he'd done, some of them working from different angles entirely. The original storage building is still standing. The family that bought the farm uses it. They upgraded some of the refrigeration equipment in the early 2000s, but the structural work, the insulated walls, the concrete floor, the framing of the mechanical room is all Marv's, and it is still sound. What I find myself thinking about when I think about Marv Kesler's story is not really the technical achievement. The adapted refrigeration system was clever, certainly. It was practical and economical, and it worked. But the technical achievement was, at its root, just good mechanical thinking applied to an available resource. What I think about more is the moment in 1984 when Marv watched that compressor go onto the scrap truck for $45, and he felt something turn over in his mind. That moment is available to anyone. The closed dairy farms were visible to everyone in Trempealeau County. The auctions were public. The equipment was sitting in yards waiting to be bought or scrapped. Nobody had a lock on the information that this equipment existed or that it was going cheap. But most people, when they looked at a salvaged dairy compressor in 1984 or 1985, saw a closed farm. They saw loss. They saw the end of something, which it was, genuinely, and the loss was real and painful, and the grief of the farm families who were closing out was completely legitimate. Marv looked at the same compressor and saw a cooling capacity that was available at almost no cost if you were willing to do the adaptation work. He wasn't callous about the closures. He'd known many of those dairy families his whole life. He understood what they were losing. But he also understood that the equipment, the cold iron sitting in those empty milk houses, was not responsible for the crisis. It hadn't caused the problem. And letting it go to scrap when it could still do useful work seemed to him like a waste that served nobody. There's a particular kind of practical wisdom that some of the older farmers of that generation carried, a capacity to look at what was actually available rather than what they wished were available, and to find the path forward from where they actually stood. It's not flashy. It doesn't translate well into the kind of story that makes the front page. It's just a man and his tools and his notebook and his willingness to keep working. Ruth Kesler passed in 2003. Marv held on in the machine shed for a few more years, but the heart went out of the work somewhat after that. He moved to a smaller place in the town of Whitehall in 2008, in his late 70s. He still had his tools. He still had his composition notebooks. The farmers in Trempealeau County who knew him, the ones who'd helped at the auction when he was hauling equipment, the ones who'd later come out to see his storage system, the ones he'd helped build their own, they have a particular way of talking about Marv. It's not effusive. These are not people who trade in extravagant praise, but there's something in the tone, a steadiness that matches the man, a kind of quiet respect that is, in that part of the world, the real currency. Gene Hafner, in an interview years later for a county historical project, said this about the man who'd once called his project just hauling scrap. Marv saw what something could be, not just what it was. That's a skill. Some people have it and most people don't. That seems right to me. In the years since, as rural Wisconsin has continued to change, as consolidation has continued, and the small, mixed-operation farms have gotten rarer, and the landscape of agriculture has shifted in ways that would have been hard to fully imagine in 1986, the particular solution that Marv built has become less directly replicable. The dairy equipment from that era is no longer abundant and cheap in the way it was during the farm crisis. The specific economic context that made his approach so powerful was, in some sense, a crisis context, a moment when an enormous amount of high-quality industrial equipment was temporarily and unusually available at salvage prices. But the thinking behind it, that capacity to look at what is actually available rather than what you wish were available, and to find the path forward from honest ground, that doesn't expire. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we spend a lot of time on stories like Marv Kesler's. Not because they're spectacular, not because they end in dramatic triumph, but because they're real, and because the kind of practical wisdom they represent is worth keeping alive. The steady work, the careful observation, the willingness to be thought peculiar for a little while when the numbers say you're right. Marv Kesler didn't save his farm by being clever. His farm didn't need saving. He'd managed it well enough that it wasn't in the kind of trouble so many of his neighbors were in. What he did was look at a crisis that was destroying other people's farms and find, in the wreckage of it, something that could be made useful. That's not a small thing. If this story connected with you, if it reminded you of someone you knew or something you've thought about in your own work, let us know in the comments. We read every one. The stories of the farmers who found their way through difficult times, quietly and practically and without a lot of fuss, deserve to be told and heard and remembered. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next story. We'll be back next week with another piece of the history of American farming, the kind that doesn't always make the textbooks, but lives in the land and the people who tend it. Until then, keep at it. The steady work is the work that lasts. This story is a dramatized composite inspired by real experiences of Wisconsin farmers during the 1980s farm crisis. Characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized for storytelling purposes.